What would you do if one day the cat who'd been with you for years was thrown from a height of 13 feet onto the floor by your 6-year-old niece? I've been in that situation, and when it happened, my whole family chose silence. To protect my cat, I had to teach them a lesson. Let's follow the story. I'll tell you why my niece did something so cruel and how I made them face the consequences of their actions. Hello, everyone. My name is Vanessa Whitaker. I'm 24 years old and currently living in Bakersfield, California, a quiet town tucked away in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley, where most folks still think of pets as just animals, not as part of the family. I own a little shop called Whisker and Tail. We specialize in pet care and sell products for animals. The shop sits at the end of a small street on the edge of town. Above it is a loft apartment where I live. It's a simple space, but cozy enough for me and Simba, my old tabby cat, to share quiet, peaceful mornings. My days start early. I usually wake up to the soft breeze-like sound of Simba's paws gliding across the wooden floor, followed by the gentle nudge of his head against my hand, as if to say, "Time to start the day." While I make coffee in the tiny kitchen, he curls up on the windowsill, basking in a narrow beam of sunlight that slips through the aged white curtains. Moments like that, simple as they are, fill me with a sense of completeness that nothing else ever could. To most people, a cat is just a pet. But to me, Simba is family. He's been my companion, my quiet refuge through college when I was living alone in a cramped room, working part-time at a bookstore, and dreaming of a future where I could finally stand on my own 2 feet. I used to believe that as long as I could hold on to the steady, simple life filled with Simba's presence, I'd never have to feel lost again. But everything changed 2 Thanksgivings ago on what seemed like an ordinary evening at my parents' old house on the east side of Bakersfield. It wasn't some huge, unforgettable disaster. But for me, what happened that night left a crack, one that even years later I haven't been able to mend. That night, I nearly lost Simba, and worse, I started to lose the people I'd always believed would stand by me no matter what. I still remember that night vividly. A chilly evening in late November, right on Thanksgiving. My whole family had gathered in the house where I grew up. The air was warm and energetic, laughter echoing through the rooms like a familiar tune that returns each holiday season. I had come home for Thanksgiving with Simba. When we entered my old bedroom, he leapt onto the chair by the window and curled up in a blanket as if he'd never left this place. To Simba, that house wasn't unfamiliar. For years, every time I visited home, I brought him along. He'd sat in Mama Elaine's lap while she read the paper, and my dad Douglas used to sneak him treats under the dinner table. In his quiet way, Simba had become just as much a part of the family as I was. That Thanksgiving, my sister Heather and her family joined us too. Her husband Mark and their daughter Emily came with her. She was the first grandchild in the family, so it wasn't hard to guess how much love was poured into her. All afternoon, Emily ran around the house in a red velvet dress and white tights, dragging a teddy bear almost as big as she was. People chuckled as she sang loudly in the living room, or swung from the staircase railing like a tiny performer on stage. Heather had married relatively young, but struggled for nearly 5 years to get pregnant. By the time Emily was born, she was almost 27. And since Emily was their only child, she naturally became the center of everyone's world. Heather and Mark loved her in the way some might call unconditionally indulgent. Maybe that kind of love helped shape Emily's defiant streak, which no one wanted to admit was there. As for me, I've never been the most patient person with kids. On previous visits, I'd had to speak to Emily when she wandered into my room to grab books or messed up wooden models I'd spent weeks putting together. I never raised my voice. I just tried to teach her where the boundaries were, gently. But in her distant eyes and the occasional cold glance after being corrected, I could sense the tension building between us. Still, I believed kids had their way of growing. Sometimes that pushback is part of how they learn to understand the world. What I didn't know was that my small attempts to guide her, those simple reminders, would become the spark behind something that even now tightens my chest when I think about it. After Thanksgiving dinner filled with turkey, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie, everyone chatted in the living room. My dad opened a bottle of wine, and my mom brought out a big fruit tray. Heather and Mark settled into the couch while I quietly stepped into the kitchen to grab more water for everyone. But when I returned, something felt off. Emily was no longer in the room. At first, I figured she must have run out to the backyard or gone to play in one of the bedrooms. But as I walked closer to the stairs, a strange feeling tightened in my chest. I couldn't explain why, but something told me to slow down. When I looked up, I saw Emily standing on the upper floor by the railing. She was holding Simba tightly in her arms. His striped fur looked tense. His legs stretched stiffly as his body was pressed against hers. What sent a chill down my spine wasn't the act itself, but Emily's face. Blank, emotionless, and before I could react, the worst happened. Still wearing that same flat expression, Emily raised Simba above her head with both hands, then threw him down from over 13 feet high. I lunged forward, throwing myself toward the bottom of the stairs in a desperate attempt to catch him. I managed to grab Simba mid-fall, but the impact knocked us hard onto the bottom steps. Simba let out a sharp, painful cry as I clutched him tightly, my knees slamming into the cold wooden floor. In that moment, I heard my mom scream. A chair crashed to the ground, and the sound of footsteps racing toward the staircase. But somehow, it all faded, like the house had gone silent instantly. I couldn't distinguish who was shouting my name or running toward me. All I could hear was my heartbeat, loud, ragged, desperate, as if it were trying to hold on to something slipping through my fingers. And when I looked up under the dim light falling from the ceiling, I still saw Emily standing there, looking down with cold eyes. No sign of panic, not a hint of remorse. A few seconds after the fall, still curled up on the cold tile floor, I held Simba tightly in my arms, out of sheer reflex. My left arm throbbed, my right shoulder was numb from the impact, but I didn't care about my own body. The only thing that consumed me was the trembling I felt through my fingertips. My cat was terrified. Still cradling him close, I gently checked each of his legs, ran my hand down his spine, and pressed lightly around his chest. No signs of broken bones, but his breathing was rapid, his ears pinned back, and his whole body was curled in on itself like he'd just escaped the claws of some invisible predator. Seeing Simba so afraid, I wanted to curl up too, to find some quiet corner and hide from the cold, slowly spreading from the inside out. Just then, I heard the sound of small footsteps coming from the staircase, steady, unhurried, unapologetic. I looked up. Emily was coming down the stairs. Step by step, calmly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her face was expressionless, her pace relaxed, as if she were returning to the dinner table after washing her hands, not walking away from having thrown a living creature from over 13 feet in the air. In that moment, my emotions broke free. I yelled, "Emily, what did you do?" Without flinching, without hesitation. In a voice so calm it made my blood run cold, Emily replied, "I gave it some kibble. It didn't eat it and tried to scratch me, so I punished it." Hearing those words from a 6-year-old's mouth, I couldn't hold back anymore. I raised my head, looked straight at her, and with a voice born from fury, I nearly growled each word. "Who taught you that?" I didn't have to shout. Every syllable carried the anger that was about to explode from my chest. After my question, she blinked once, then said in the same flat tone, "Mom says, if you don't fight back, people will bully you your whole life." When she said that, it felt like someone reached into my chest and squeezed, not painful, just suffocating. Seconds later, I turned to look at Heather. She was standing nearby. She didn't say a word, didn't step forward to check on me. Her head lowered, her fingers twisted together like she wanted the moment to pass quickly. Standing just behind her, Mark gave a slight shake of his head. His eyes met mine with a look of clear annoyance, like I was the one blowing things out of proportion over something that didn't matter. Then, with a strange calmness, my mother walked over. Seeing me still clutching Simba, she asked in a light voice, as if nothing severe had just happened, "Are you okay? Is Simba hurt?" I didn't answer. I just gently lifted Simba closer so she could see him. After a few seconds of looking him over, she spoke with a tone of relief. "He's fine. That's all that matters." That sentence hit my ears like a final verdict. Casual, unquestioning, and without a single word directed at the child who caused it all. In that moment, I held Simba even tighter. His fur was still damp with sweat, and my heart froze. I realized a line was blurred between love and enabling, between family and complicit silence. And right there in the house I once believed was the safest place in the world, I felt like an outsider, more alone than I'd ever been. With the pain in my shoulder still pulsing, all I could do was sit there holding Simba tightly in my arms. Since I was 19, he had been with me for over 3 years. When I decided to leave home and start my own life, That year, I didn't go out of anger or conflict. I left because I needed a quiet space to figure out who I was. Simba was the one presence I felt I could trust completely in my first apartment, barely over 200 square feet. Every time I came home after a long day, I knew there'd always be eyes waiting for me at the window. A soft meow like a sigh, and a quiet, warm presence that filled the room without a single word. The loneliness of living on my own slowly faded from the moment Simba came into my life. Everything felt lighter, even on the most exhausting days. And yet, right in front of the people I loved most, I had almost lost the one companion I loved more than anything else, in a way I could have never imagined. Still catching my breath, I could feel a heat building in my chest, sharp, burning, impossible to contain. I looked around the room, hoping anyone would say something about what had happened, but no one did. The silence in the room pressed against me like a wall. My every breath felt like a challenge, like I wasn't just hurting, I was being tested. My legs were still shaky from the fall. So I stood, trying to keep my voice from cracking with rage. I spoke clearly. This isn't a joke. This is a life. What's wrong with all of you? How can you sit there and say nothing? My words dropped into the room like a stone. No one responded, but I saw the signs. My mother's eyes darted away. Mark's scowl deepened, and my sister's face flushed red, not with shame, but with anger. Then, with a voice shrill enough to drown out reason, Heather shouted, "She's just a kid. What the hell is wrong with you? Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" Mark jumped in right after, his tone hard. "She's 6. What the hell are you blowing this up for?" As the last word left his mouth, I turned toward him. My lips pressed into a tight line. My heart pounded, not from rage, but from shock. Complete shock. I wasn't alone in this house. I was out of place. Before I could speak again, I heard my mother's voice behind me, soft, but sharp enough to cut. "You're always too sensitive. Just let it go if no one's hurt." That sentence didn't hit me like a slap. It was worse. It made me feel like I no longer existed in their eyes, like my pain, my voice, even my presence didn't register anymore. After everything they had just said, I looked at each one, hoping someone might say something that made sense, that someone might stand on the side of what's right. But all I saw was indifference, or worse, defensiveness. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I looked around and asked, "So you're all just going to cover for this? A child just threw a cat down the stairs. You don't see anything wrong with that?" I hadn't even finished the sentence when Heather cut in, screaming as if I had just insulted her to the core. "Don't you dare preach to us!" At her words, something in me shut down. I froze. Then, without even thinking, I took a step back. My hand still gripped Simba. My breathing grew heavier. I couldn't tell what hurt more, my sister's words or the cold, mocking smirk on the face of a first grader hiding behind her mother, just visible enough for me to see clearly. In that moment, I lifted my head, and I no longer believed I was standing in the house where I grew up. Then something settled deep inside me. A voice, quiet but steady, rising from somewhere I couldn't ignore. If no one else is going to speak up, I have to be the first. In the thick, suffocating air of that room, where no one dared to speak the truth, where every glance either avoided mine or looked at me like I was the problem, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. Still clutching Simba in my arms, with a voice calm in a way that even surprised me, I looked each family member in the eye and said clearly, "I'm reporting this to Animal Control and the Child Psychology Center. This is behavior that needs intervention." When those words left my mouth, a furious scream cut through the room, making everyone flinch. Heather's eyes burned with rage as she practically shouted in my face, "Are you out of your damn mind, Vanessa?" Before I could respond, Mark stepped toward me, face flushed deep red, his fists clenched so tight they shook. His voice came out low and sharp, nothing like the calm brother-in-law I once knew, as he threatened, "If you report this, I won't let it slide. Emily is the most important thing in my life." I didn't flinch. His words landed like a block of ice inside me, not because of the threat, but because of the blindness behind it. He looked me straight in the eye and defended an act of cruelty under the name of love. And what hurt even more was that I had once believed in the man standing before me. I had once trusted that he would be level-headed enough to know the difference between right and wrong, but it didn't stop there. From behind me, my mother's voice rose, shaking with anger. "You're tearing this family apart, Vanessa." I turned back toward her just as she finished speaking. Looking straight into her eyes, I answered, not loudly, but with absolute certainty. No, it's the silence that's tearing this family apart. Everything went still after that final sentence, like a challenge in the room's heart. But this time, the silence didn't come from hesitation. It came from the fact that everyone had already crossed a line, a place where truth had been buried under denial, a place where no one asked about the cat in my arms or what had just happened. They weren't defending a pet. They were defending a child at all costs, no matter how wrong she had been. And then, just as the tension reached a point beyond saving, a loud crash came from behind, the sound of glass hitting the tile floor, shattering into pieces. I spun around, startled. Behind the display cabinet, a glass trophy had fallen and shattered on the tile floor. Shards were scattered everywhere, and when I saw the face of the person standing closest to it, my heart clenched, because at that moment I realized I wasn't the only one who saw this was wrong. The sharp sound of glass shattering rang out from the display cabinet, and everyone in the room flinched. I looked down at the floor just seconds after the impact. Scattered at my father's feet were shards of broken glass. Among the wreckage, I could still make out the faint inscription left on the base of the fallen trophy. President's Volunteer Service Award, Heather Simmons, age 17. For a few moments, no one said a word. The entire room felt frozen in the weight of what had just happened. Then, wide-eyed and stunned, Heather screamed again. "What the hell are you doing, Dad?" My father stood motionless, his arms hanging at his sides. The calm expression I had always known was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice raspy but firm. "You think you still deserve that award?" His words hit Heather like a blow. Her breath shortened. Her hands trembled, but she still snapped back. "What did I do wrong? I'm just protecting my daughter." That's when my father turned to face her completely. His eyes cut through her like they could see everything she'd ever tried to hide. He said, "Wrong? You don't think you're wrong? You're raising a child who reflects the same mistakes you've never dared to face. 10 years ago, I found your abortion papers in the drawer of your desk." The second he said it, it was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Heather stood frozen, speechless. Mark turned slowly to look at his wife, his face blank, stunned. Elaine jumped to her feet and rushed to cover Emily's ears, pulling the little girl into her arms. In the center of the chaos, my father continued, his voice deeper now, weighed down. "I stayed quiet because I thought you'd grow. I believed you'd become better if I didn't bring it up. But no, you didn't change. You just passed on the worst parts of yourself to your child." Mark no longer resembled the composed man I once knew. He looked at Heather, then away, as if he no longer knew how to face her or himself. What he had just heard seemed to shake the foundation of his beliefs about his family. Heather lowered her head at my father's words. Tears streamed down her face. Her voice cracked and broke as she choked out, "You don't have the right to bring that up now." But my father's gaze stayed steady, and this time he wasn't angry. He shook his head and spoke slowly. "Yes, I do. Because I'm the one who stayed silent for 10 years to protect your reputation, and this family's." While the argument unraveled, I stood still. I didn't interrupt. I didn't take my eyes off my father. In my arms, Simba had stopped trembling. He lay quietly against my chest, eyes closed, tail gently twitching. His breathing had finally returned to a calm rhythm, soft and steady, like a breeze gliding across water. And I realized it was he who was helping me stay calm now. In a room full of accusations, confused stares, and a past suddenly dragged out into the light, I felt something inside me begin to settle. And I understood. Sometimes misplaced love can be more toxic than hate. After my father spoke, the air in the room became so heavy that no one could breathe normally. It was like something had just collapsed in the middle of the room. Not a scream, not anger, but a truth so massive that all anyone could do was stand there and watch it be bare. Heather, the woman who had just shouted in anger a few minutes ago, was now standing in the middle of the living room, clutching the edge of a chair, eyes wide and unblinking. Her face had gone pale, and her shoulders were tense. The harsh words from earlier had vanished, leaving behind a woman trying to keep her balance after being struck by something ripped from the past. Mark, the husband who had stood beside Heather for years, because he believed she was strong, knew what she wanted, and lived with responsibility, was now leaning near the window frame. He didn't step forward or walk away. His eyes rested on Heather, not steady as they once were, but quiet and confused, as if his mind was rewinding all the years they had lived together, trying to find some detail that had been overlooked. And then, in that silence, it seemed he realized the woman on the verge of collapsing in front of him was no longer the image he thought he understood. A few seconds later, as if trying to break the silence tightening around the room, Heather burst into tears. She turned toward my mother, her voice catching in her throat before breaking into a hurt-filled call. "Mom, why aren't you saying anything? Why aren't you taking my side?" That sentence didn't need to be loud. It was enough to make the whole room shift. It was a plea, not to defend herself, but a fragile hope from a daughter being pushed into a corner, hoping her mother would still cover her. My mother was still sitting in her chair. Her hands were tightly clasped together. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, not avoiding, but also not seeking anyone's gaze. There was no sign she wanted to stop anything. Only silence, and the presence of someone tired of holding the balance of this family. About a minute later, after regaining his composure, Mark took another step forward. His voice broke in pauses, like someone trying to hide the tremor inside. He asked Heather, "How long have you been hiding that from me?" Heather didn't respond to her husband's question. She collapsed beside the chair, her shoulders pulled in, her face buried in her hands. Sharp, broken breaths echoed through the room, which was now completely still. I stood where I was. I didn't move toward anyone. I looked at each face and reaction like someone watching a collapse from which no one could run. My father was still standing near the window. He didn't turn around. He just let out a long breath, then spoke again, his voice low, almost like he was talking to himself. "A family where everyone lives with secrets no longer has the shape of a family?" His words sank the room even deeper. Every sound and breath pulled inward. Every look seemed to hit something that couldn't be put into words. And then a small voice rose, soft like wind brushing against a window. Emily was still sitting close to my mother, her head resting lightly against the arm that had just covered her ears, a gesture she was already familiar with whenever the adults started saying things kids weren't supposed to hear. She looked up, her eyes wide, clear, but no longer carrying the gaze of an innocent child. In a flat voice, almost a whisper, she asked, "If my mom did something wrong, does she get punished like Simba too, Grandma?" That question rang out like a final bell in a house already full of muffled noise. No one answered Emily when she asked a question that cut to the heart of every person in that room, but I heard it clearly. That question didn't need an explanation. It was proof that everything the adults had tried to hide had now reached the youngest one in the family. And when no one in that room dared to speak again, I knew there was still one person who needed to hear the whole story. While Emily was still sitting beside her grandmother, her head resting on her arm, her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her dress as if she didn't fully understand the storm that had just swept through the room. At that moment, my father stepped forward, his eyes not looking at anyone else, a heavy gaze that had just awakened inside him. He sat down next to his granddaughter. His voice wasn't loud, but there was a weight to it that made everyone listen. "Do you know that hurting others is something you shouldn't do?" Emily looked up as soon as he finished. She stared at my father with her clear eyes, then answered slowly and clearly, "If they hurt you first, then it's not wrong." Right after she said that, I saw my father's hand clench. The knuckles showed clearly under his tense skin. He closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to swallow something rising in his chest. Then, in a lower voice, he asked again, "Who told you that?" Emily sat up straight, her eyes steady and unblinking. Her voice came out calm, like she was repeating something she had memorized. "My mom said so. She said, 'If you're not cruel, people will walk all over you.'" I saw my father freeze at her answer. He was still sitting next to Emily, but his body seemed drained of warmth. In his eyes, what had just been spoken wasn't just a sentence. It was a clear sign that something had gone wrong from the very root. After a moment of silence, my father asked again, this time in a deeper tone, as if testing her, "What if I accidentally broke a toy you love? What would you do?" As soon as he finished, Emily replied in a flat voice, "I'd break the thing you love the most." Time seemed to stop in the room the moment she finished. My mother placed a hand over her mouth, tears beginning to fall. She looked at Emily, eyes wet, her gaze far away, as if she had just seen something harrowing that she no longer had the strength to stop. I gently held Simba tighter in my arms. His chest rose and fell, still breathing steadily, but my own heart was growing colder. Not out of fear of Emily, but because of what she was repeating as a natural result of the things adults had planted into her young mind. After everything Emily said, I no longer saw a child. I saw a small mirror reflecting the most twisted parts of the adults who thought they could keep those things hidden. She was learning to understand her small world through the cracks the grown-ups left behind. In silence. Faced with the cold words coming from the mouth of a 6-year-old child, with a way of thinking that no longer seemed to recognize the line between right and wrong, everyone in my family knew something in her had gone off course, and none of us had realized it soon enough. A few seconds later, as the heavy silence blanketed the room, my father turned to look at Mark and Heather. His voice rang out clearly, each word landing like a deliberate reminder. "What do you two think about this? If she grows up believing that, what kind of life will she live?" No one answered the question from the man who had spent his life teaching others to live by principles. Douglas Whitaker, my father, had been a human resources manager at a regional oil company. He wasn't a man of many words, but he lived with a clear sense of right and wrong. In his eyes, the most important thing a person could leave behind for their children wasn't money or reputation, but how they treated others when no one was watching. He was the one who taught both Heather and me to keep our promises, admit when we were wrong, and, most of all, stand on the side of what's right, even if it meant being misunderstood. I remember clearly on the night Emily was born, he looked at Heather with quiet eyes and said, "From now on, you're allowed to be tired, to be confused, but live in a way that someday your daughter can lift her head and say, 'My mom is a good person.'" That sentence stayed with me for years. But now, standing in this room, hearing him ask his daughter that same question with a voice filled with helplessness, I understood something. Even the most explicit warnings given early on don't always stop someone from straying off the path. After my father's question, Heather turned away. She walked over and pulled Emily into her arms. She didn't offer any explanation, no defense. She just held her daughter tightly and walked out of the living room. Mark followed behind her, his steps slow, his head lowered, as if trying to hold on to the last bit of composure he had left. The room fell into silence as my sister's small family walked out. There were no more conversations, no sign of a joyful reunion. Near the display cabinet, a few shards of glass still lay scattered. The wine glasses were half full, and plates of unfinished food sat on the table. Everything that had once felt warm now lingered only as an aftertaste. I stood in the middle of that room, not fully grasping what had happened, still stunned by the sudden departure of my sister and brother-in-law. I felt my father's gaze. He didn't say much, just let out a quiet breath and spoke calmly. "Do what you need to do." I looked up at him. His words felt like the final lock being opened inside me. When everything had already passed the point of a simple family disagreement, I knew this was no longer a matter of right or wrong between adults. This needed intervention. After everything that had just happened, I understood one thing clearly. Silence protects no one. Silence only gives room for what's broken to grow deeper. After Heather's family left, I wrapped Simba in an old knitted blanket and took him to the familiar vet clinic at the edge of town. It was the place I had always taken him for vaccinations and seasonal checkups. The vet scrutinized him, ran x-rays, and confirmed that Simba was physically safe, just signs of trauma, heightened defensive response, and a need for rest in a quiet environment. I exhaled deeply when I heard the results. My chest was still tight, but at least I knew I hadn't been too late. Still, I understood something clearly. What waited ahead wasn't at the vet clinic. What I was about to do would redraw the boundaries within my family, and once I crossed that line, there would be no way back. The next day, I replayed the footage from the living room security camera, one that my father had installed last year after a break-in during the night. As I scrubbed through the recording, I nearly held my breath. The conversation between my father and Emily appeared clearly. There was no yelling, no coercion, just a child repeating what she had learned from adults in a calm, chillingly steady voice. That afternoon, I submitted the video and Simba's veterinary report to the Kern County Child Protective Services and the local animal control unit. 3 days later, representatives from both agencies conducted home visits at my parents' house at the end of Marigold Street, where the incident happened, and Heather's residence in the Willow Creek neighborhood about 4 blocks away. At both sites, they assessed the living environment, spoke individually with family members, and observed the overall atmosphere in each home. Heather reacted violently the moment she was notified of the intervention. She stormed into the coordination office with red eyes and a trembling voice, accusing me of betraying the family and calling my actions destructive. But deep down, I knew what she feared most wasn't public shame. It was losing her role as a mother. Once the procedures were complete, Child Protective Services assigned an independent psychologist to evaluate Emily's behavior across 3 private sessions. She was taken to the regional therapy center without any family members accompanying her. The preliminary results arrived a week later. The report stated that Emily exhibited uncontrolled retaliatory behavior, difficulty connecting emotions with actions, and a high risk of behavioral deviation if left unaddressed. The doctor recommended placing her in a behavioral therapy program for a period of 3 to 6 months. Under professional guidance, the Department of Family Services issued a formal recommendation, but Heather resisted fiercely. She insisted her daughter was normal and that the real problem was everyone who interfered in their lives. She cried, then screamed, but nothing stopped the final decision. That day, I went with my father to the intake office of the center, as he had signed the intervention request and was required to be present during the transfer. Emily didn't fully understand what was happening, but could feel the separation. She screamed and struggled, sobbing as the staff led her to the car. She turned back to all of us and cried out, "I'm not going. I didn't do anything wrong. You all hate me." Her cries echoed down the hallway, each one cutting deep. I stood still, holding the case file tightly to my chest. Beside me, my father stared at the slowly closing door, unmoving. Mark stood farther back. As the vehicle pulled away from the gate, I saw him cry. He didn't hide it or turn away. The tear rolled down his chin quietly, like a weight finally slipping off after being carried for too long. In the end, my father signed the confirmation form. He affirmed that he was a witness, and the person who had directly requested Emily's placement in therapy. And in that moment, watching him sign his name on that document, I'll never forget the look in his eyes as we left the office. He didn't say a word, but his gaze told me everything, that he had done what needed to be done, and that he hoped I would keep standing for what's right, no matter what. And maybe for the first time I saw the system side with what was right, not to punish anyone, but to preserve a piece of humanity quietly unraveling through time and silence. Since the day Emily was taken away, kicking, screaming, with her parents' late and helpless tears trailing behind her, I had no idea what had happened inside my sister's home. I didn't know if they were still speaking to each other or how many arguments had erupted since. All I knew was that while Emily was still undergoing psychological treatment at the Terry facility, that family was quietly falling apart in a way none of us had ever wanted to see. One weekend afternoon, I stopped by to visit my dad. I had just set Simba down on his small bed in the living room when the doorbell rang. Rapid, urgent. My mom went to open the door, and seconds later, a familiar voice erupted through the house, freezing us in place. My sister, Heather, stood at the door, her face flushed, her eyes wild with panic and rage. Without greeting anyone, she stormed straight into the living room and shouted, "Vanessa, you're the one who destroyed this family." Before I could react, Heather turned to our father, pointing directly at him, her voice cracking through tears. "He's divorcing me because of you. Because of you. My poor daughter is stuck in some strange place with no one she knows, no one who loves her." The moment the words left her mouth, my mom grabbed her daughter's shoulders. Her voice trembled like a plea. "Stop it. That's enough." But Heather didn't seem to hear anything anymore. She shoved my mom's hands away and kept screaming. "If you hadn't brought up the past, if Vanessa hadn't blown everything out of proportion over a damn cat, none of this would have happened. Is that what you all wanted? To see me lose everything?" My fists clenched at her words, my whole body burning. But it wasn't the words that hit me. It was how she refused to take responsibility for anything, like nothing that had happened was her fault. Before I could speak, my father stepped forward. He stood in front of Heather. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't warn her. He raised his hand and slapped her across the cheek. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to bring the entire room to a standstill. Heather took a step back, stunned, not from the force, but from the fact that the man who had always been gentle with his children had just hit her. Her expression flickered from shock to disbelief. And my father, his face full of anger and helplessness, looked like in over 30 years of being a father. This was the first time he had no other way to act. After a few seconds of silence, he looked her straight in the eye. His voice was slow and firm. "Get out. If you say one more word to disgrace this family, you are no longer a part of it. Today." That sentence landed like a final verdict. No one came to her defense. No one argued. I knew Heather still believed that somehow she'd be forgiven. But after that day, everything broke, clearly, silently, just like how she walked out of the house that afternoon. And today marks exactly 2 years since it all happened. After a long period of therapy, Emily returned to live with my sister. Mark is no longer there. After finalizing the divorce, he left a silence that no one in the family mentions anymore. The two now live in a small apartment just a few steps from my parents' house. Maybe that's how my sister chose to face her mistakes. Not to ask for forgiveness, but to remind herself daily that there's still something left to make right. Emily is now 8. She's no longer the child hiding in the room's corner with a vacant stare. With the help of the therapists and teachers my father reached out to, she has changed, little by little, enough for everyone in the family to see that what once went off course can be gently steered back if the grown-ups have enough patience. One afternoon, 6 months after she came home, I received a small envelope that my father handed me. Inside was a packet of cat treats and a sheet of notebook paper. In the letter, Emily wrote that she had saved up her own money to buy a gift for Simba. She wanted to say sorry and wrote that if she ever had the chance, she hoped to apologize to Simba in person, to make amends. I read that letter over and over, not just for what it said, but because I could feel something beginning to grow again inside that child. A kind of genuine emotion, not perfect, but real and slowly maturing. As for Simba, he's still here, 2 years older now. He no longer leaps around every morning like he used to. These days, he mostly lies on the windowsill, eyes half closed in the sunlight. He's calmer now, slower, but still the one companion who stayed by my side while everything else unraveled. My parents don't bring up the past anymore, but in the way they look at Emily, I see something softer, as if, even without words, they're quietly hoping this family can somehow be stitched back together, one small act at a time. Maybe that's the most human wish any parent can hold on to. As for me, after graduating, I used the savings I'd built up from years of part-time work and a small bit of help from my parents to open Whisker and Tail. It's a space I created for the ones who've been left behind, for people trying to rebuild trust, and for myself, the person who almost lost everything just for holding on to something others thought was small. If there's anything I want to leave behind from the story, maybe it's this. Every living being that shows up in this world carries within them the chance to be loved. Whether it's a child still learning how to be kind, or a small cat thrown from a staircase inside a house that should have felt warm. What they need isn't perfection. They need someone patient enough to stay when they're most fragile, and kind enough not to leave when they lose their way. And that's where my story ends. Before I go, I want to ask you one thing. Was I wrong for speaking up to protect a voiceless creature, even if it meant breaking apart a family? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear them. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it. Thank you, and see you next time.